Okay, guys, today we're going to work on remote lesson 1 for AP Seminar. So we're just going to go through a number of things today just to review some of the stuff that we've talked about in class before we left. So first thing we're going to do is talk about the directions, exactly what you need to do. We're going to talk real quick about the stimulus material, discuss in detail rows 1 and 2. Like we said earlier before class, we really wanted you to make sure that those two were taken care of, and I'll explain why that's so important in a second. And we're going to take a look at some student examples of high scores in rubric rows 1 and 2. And then finally, we'll finish up with essential use. How do you use the sources so that you get credit in the rows, row 1 and 2. All right? Good? All right, so let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about what you have to do. All right, so looking at the task directions, we've already looked at the stimulus material. We've come up with some thematic connections that we've talked about. If you have any issues with that, definitely send me a text or the remind, or send me an email so we can talk a little bit about it. You've composed a research question. That's one of the things I wanted to concentrate on today. Gather information from additional sources, make sure it's scholarly, and we want you to make sure that you evaluate the evidence that you're using and you're going to convey your perspective. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a couple things here. First thing I wanted to discuss is that I wanted you to think about this again, the research question. All right, one of the things you have to make sure that we're doing is you have a research question now, and as you're doing your research and you're typing your paper, you have to make sure that whatever you respond in your paper matches the question. So the question is not set in stone. Remember, you can change the question after you do your research, after you do your paper, so that your paper reflects an answer to your question. So don't get nervous or anxious if over time it changes. Okay, so it happened with a couple students already where they went in one direction. They realized, hey, I should change my question this way so that it fits where my research is going. That's fine. That's exactly what we want you to do. So if you have a research question, you do the research, you write the paper, and the paper doesn't exactly match the question, change the question. All right? So that's one thing we want to make sure that everyone gets. The second thing I want to talk about is this last bullet point here. And this part here conveys your perspective. All right, that's something that we have to make essential in this paper, and that is the idea that you have to have an argument. You are not reporting on, you're not making an IRR, you're making an individual written argument now. So you have to convey your argument in this case by drawing on other people's, other researchers' perspectives. All right, so you're taking other perspectives and you're trying to convey your own argument about your issue or your question. Okay, so let's move on to the next. All right, so just real quick, like I said before, refine your original research question, identify opposing or alternate views. You definitely have to have that counterclaim in there. You have to compose this coherent, convincing, written argument, and these are all the pieces of it. And the most important too for what we're going to talk about today are these first two bullets. You have to identify and explain the relationship of your inquiry to a theme or connection among at least two of the stimulus materials and incorporate at least one of the stimulus materials in your paper. And we're going to talk, that's really what today's lesson is all about, making sure that we get that done. A couple other things I just want to make sure that you go through all the rest of these. You can read them on your own. You have to do a word count. You have to keep under 2,000 words. We want to try to keep under 2,000 words. You can do it by eliminating unnecessary stuff, all right? And we have to upload these documents, obviously, to the digital portfolio before May 26th, all right? So that's where we're at right now. We're going to move on to the next slide. All right, just to review, everyone has read and analyzed these these sources, right? The one, Have You Renounced Pleasure, On Virtue and Happiness, High Income Improves Evaluation of Life, Big Daddy's Last Dance, Genes, Economics, and Happiness, The Story of an Hour, and The Happiness Project. So you've looked at all these, and even if you just looked at the titles, you can obviously come up with a theme, right? And the theme is something that we've talked about in class, that you guys have discussed in class, and there are many different themes that you could use throughout if you just connect two of these sources. All right, so we've talked about that. You guys did the analysis of it. You did a lot of the work with that. I think everyone's good to go with where they're going with respect to their question and what materials they're going to use, what source materials they're going to use. All right, so like I've talked about in class already, for the purpose of the IWA, if the response is not in any way related to a theme connecting at least two of the stimulus, it will be counted as off topic and will receive a score of 0. We've talked about that a bunch of times. We have to make sure that we connect the stimulus to a theme, for our paper. All right, and this is the reason why. All right, so if you look at the rubric, okay, the first 2 rows, it's either 5 points or 0 points. You're not going to do all this work to get 0 points. So you have to make sure that this thing is done the right way with respect to these 2 rubric rows. So the first rubric row is the response demonstrates the relevance of at least one of the stimulus material to the argument by integrating it as part of the response. Example, as providing relevant context for the research question or as evidence to support relevant claims. So it has to be an essential part of your paper in some way. So the advice from the College Board is to use the stimulus, one of the stimulus materials at least 2 times in your paper, either in the context part and then must be done in the body paragraphs. All right, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The response explains the significance or importance of the research question by situating it within a larger context. You have to do the context. Why is it so important? All right, why is your issue necessary to be researched? But remember, the key to this is there's no in between here. It's either 5 or 0. So we have to make sure that these 2 pieces are done so that you get the credit and it's not off topic. So that's why it's so important to figure out how you're going to go about doing that. So what I decided to do is I'm going to go back and look at the 2017 stimulus and then look at a couple of examples of student work from the 2017 stimulus to give you an idea how to go about doing this. So these were the stimulus materials from that: World Without Work, The Myth of Sisyphus, Long Working Hours and Cancer Risk, We Can Do It, which is the Rosie Riveter, We Can Do It image, Address to the Nation on Labor Day, and a chapter in Wealth of Nations from Adam Smith. And just looking at these stimulus materials, you can see that the stimulus that year had to do, one of the themes was work. The primary theme was work. All right, so let's take a look at how that came across in student work. All right, so I'm going to read this with you and then we'll talk a little bit about it. The notion of night shift employment has existed since the dawn of industrialization, has played an integral role in the United States economy. Today, the night shift remains prevalent in U.S. society, harboring more than 21 million workers. Its continued practice, however, has raised concern about its potential health detriments. A study from the British Journal of Cancer suggests that long working hours, which many night shifts consist of, may share a link to long-term risks such as breast cancer. Former U.S. President Richard Nixon famously said in a 1971 speech addressed to the nation on Labor Day that people must always remember that the most important part of the quality of life is the quality of work, perhaps hinting at the Occupational Safety and Healthy Act he signed into law a year prior. But neither the OSHA nor any federal law currently imposes specific regulations on night shifts, allowing employers to establish their own workforce policies. Although night shift workers cope with their schedules, it is imperative to understand the current status of night work and how it might be managed by employers. Such evaluation brings up the question, what do the current health impacts of the night shift suggest about a need for its future regulation in the U.S.? Okay, so looking at this paragraph that we just read, this right here is one of the sources, and this is another one of the sources. So you have 2 sources here that are connected to a theme about working hours, in this case, the night shift. All right, so this student was able to connect the theme to, to their paper. Okay, so this qualifies for the part of the rubric that says you have to connect the themes. However, this is not essential use of any of the documents. This is in the context of the paper. So when we talk about essential use, it has to be in the argumentative part of your paper. All right, so took 2 sources from the source material, all right, and now has added it to the context, and the reader, the grader, knows that this paper has used the stimulus as a jumping off point for their question. The key is it cannot be tangential. It has to be a strong connection to the two. A strong connection to the stimulus and to your question. All right, so now how does the author of this paper use the stimulus in a much more how do you say it? At least what we would say is essential use of the document. All right, meaning this is how you explain it. If the source was not in the paper, it would weaken the argument. So if you use a source and it was taken out and it didn't weaken your argument, it had no effect on it, then it's not a good use of that source. The source must be used so that if you took it out, it would weaken your argument. So let's take a look right here in the second sentence here. Another major concern that arises with night shifts is the increased risk of breast cancer. An unbiased study with a sample size of 116,462 individuals conducted by researchers from the British Journal of Cancer suggests an association between long working hours and breast cancer. That's the source right there. The finding can indicate that night workers who work long hours have a higher chance of developing breast cancer, although analysis of the study's confounding variables proposes no link between cancer and night work itself. Despite this, researchers from the University of Manchester Faculty of Biology find that circadian misalignment caused by night shift indeed triggers abnormal gene expression in the breast, and working night shifts 3 or more times per month elevates the risk of breast cancer. Let me explain what was done right there, and so we can move on here. All right, so what we've already noticed here is this is the source, okay? That's the stimulus that was used. So the author of this paper is using the stimulus and using textual evidence from the stimulus, all right, which is important because you're using it as evidence for your claim, and then also connects it to another piece of evidence here, all right? So let me just change this real quick. Do it freehand. All right, so when they move from this article, which is the stimulus, to this piece of evidence, they are using the stimulus to connect to something else that they've done the research for, some original research. All right, so that is how you would use it within the paper to get the 5 points on that rubric row. So connect 2 sources in your introduction, then use one of those 2 sources in your paper to further your argument. And if you do that, you should be good to go with respect to the rubric. And I'm going to explain that a little bit in a different way in a second. Okay, so let's go with these 4 goals when you're using one of the stimulus materials in your paper. The source must be used outside the introduction. Okay, now it can be used inside the introduction as well, and it should be, right? Because you have to connect 2 sources to a theme to your research question. But you also have to use that source outside of the introduction, and you have to use textual evidence from the source. It has to interact with other evidence, and the argument will be changed if the source was removed. If you do that, if you do those 4 things with one of the source materials, you'll get those 5 points. Now, I know I've been harping on this since the beginning, but it is an essential part of what we're doing for your paper, your IWA. All right, so like I've said before, if you have a question, definitely send me a text or the remind or an email so that we can discuss this further. Make sure that you get in contact with me if you run into any troubles that I can probably might be able to help you with. Okay? All right.